today, whichever war situation or conflict situation you look at, there is always the role of the veto, and that role has been dominated by the national interest of that big power, the permanent member of the Security Council. That veto has not been regulated or applied with a global perspective or the interests of the entire membership, etc. It is a very unilateral and national approach, which is using the veto as a lever in the hand of the major power. And as I said, it goes against the principle of great power responsibility.
Welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. We are going to be talking about the UN at 80. And our guest today is Ambassador Asoke Mukerji, who served as permanent representative to the UN in New York. He's also helped transform India's relationship with the 5 newly independent countries following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and was India's first charge d'affaires in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. And he's also served as India's delegate to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, among other senior positions in India and abroad. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador. It's a delight to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
You know, I wanted to start this because we are marking the 80th year of the United Nations. And for some reason, I happen to be a bit of a pessimist, and I know that you have been very, very actively involved with the UN. But let's start with a very basic question. How relevant is the UN for today's world?
Well, the answer to that question is really in how relevant is international cooperation to any country in today's world. Can a country survive without international cooperation? If not, then you need the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. So, I understand that. In fact, our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, recently flagged several concerns while he was sort of, stressing that India is committed to the UN and multilateralism. He also spoke of polarized debates, obstruction of reforms, financial constraints. But one of the things that I found interesting was that he spoke about the protection of terrorists by Security Council members. He also, of course, spoke about slowing down of the SDG agenda and disregard for the global South concern. Among these, I mean, how would you characterize these concerns, and how many of them are relevant?
Well, I think all these concerns are relevant and actually have been articulated by India and by many other countries of what are known as the Global South in the past 5 years after the COVID pandemic. And of these concerns that have been flagged, I think the most important is the need for making the United Nations relevant for its member states and to make the United Nations effective in the way it functions on the ground. And if you look at each of the issues that you mentioned as having been referred to by our External Affairs Minister, you notice that each of these issues is directly connected with both the relevance and the effectiveness of the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. So, but if you were to take them one by one, could you just elaborate a little bit on those issues that he did raise?
Well, I think if you look at the first issue is actually of how countries approach their membership of the United Nations, because it must be remembered, although it happened 80 years ago, that the United Nations operates on the basis of its charter, and the charter is a negotiated treaty. It's something that countries have committed themselves to, and each country has ratified in its own domestic process. So there is an obligation on countries to abide by the United Nations Charter. Today, I think a lot of people have tended to to look at the United Nations like other groupings like the G20 or the BRICS, but neither the G20 nor the BRICS operate on a treaty or a charter. Therefore, the obligations of countries participating in the G20 or the BRICS are not tied down in a legal sense as their obligations under the UN Charter. So that's, I think, the first point. The second is regarding the financial constraints, but these actually have been shown in the past few years to not be such a major issue. It's an issue for the UN Secretariat because the financing of the UN budget directly impacts on the way the UN Secretariat operates. In India, for example, the UN Secretariat is represented by the UN resident coordinator and all the UN bodies which are coordinated by him in India. But the UN budget by itself does not affect the participation of member states in the UN in implementing the UN Charter. And when you look at the figure, it's only $3.72 billion. In today's world, annual budget of $3.72 billion is not really such a huge figure that will impact on the work of countries in international cooperation. And and therefore I think we need to have a little perspective on an initiative taken by the UN Secretary General, which he called UN at 80. That is limited to the way the UN Secretariat will work in keeping with the amount of money being made available to it under its budget. And here I think one of the points to be kept in mind is that not all the contributors to the UN budget are meeting their commitments to give money to the United Nations on time. And one of the major defaulters is the biggest financial contributor to the UN, the United States. It is in arrears. So I think that that's a separate issue, but I don't think that need to deflect us from the reason the UN is relevant or why the UN should exist. Those are different and bigger questions than the question of the financial issues. And in terms of the work being done by the United Nations, I think today there is a consensus that the work is focused on development related, peace and security related issues. For a long time, excuse me, for a long time until 2015, development was not a pillar or the main agenda of the United Nations. The United Nations was dominated by discussions on peace and security. But in 2015, unanimously, all the 193 countries of the United Nations agreed that peace, security, and development are interlinked. And without peace and security, you can't have development. And without development, you can't have peace and security. So that is the broad UN framework. And when you apply it to individual countries, for example, we talk of India, then from 2014 onwards, 2015 onwards, our government has publicly declared that the UN's agenda of development is aligned with the agenda of transforming India into a developed country. So, this is something that makes the United Nations directly relevant to a country like India and for the transformation of India. So this is something that I think needs to be kept in mind when looking at the headlines and seeing that wars have broken out, people have been impacted, and so on. Because the perspective with which we see the destruction and devastation on the ground caused by
Mhm.
war and conflict is today needs to be seen through the prism of the effect of that war and conflict on the development of that region or that state. And I think that that
Mhm.
perspective is very often missing in the analysis that people do of the United Nations.
But coming back to security, do you think perhaps the UN needs a bit more teeth when it comes to dealing with these things?
Well, in security, I think there are two aspects to how we look at security and the United Nations and its charter today. The first is purely in terms of maintaining peace and security. We need to look at the body that is entrusted by this job by the UN Charter, which is the Security Council. And I think it's now widely agreed that the UN Security Council is ineffective and needs to be reformed because its decisions are not enforced on the ground when it takes decisions. And more often, its decisions are blocked by the use of vetoes. So, uh, if you look at just that issue by itself, then the core reason for the UN Security Council not being effective, not being able to implement its decisions on the ground, is the veto power. In 1945, when the charter was negotiated, the veto was objected to by a very large number of countries. In fact, as many as 30 out of 50 countries did not want the veto, but it was pushed into the charter on the assurance, on there are two assurances given. One was the assurance that the great powers, the five permanent members, would act under the principle of great power responsibility, which meant that they would act collectively and ensure peace and security. Now, very soon after the charter was came into effect in 1946, this principle started fraying, and today it is shattered. There is no visible example of great power responsibility of the five permanent members acting together, and therefore the foundation on the basis of which the veto was agreed to no longer exists. And I think that this needs to be talked about and acted upon more and more. The second part of looking at the peace and security issue is related to the actual application of the charter on the ground. And in the charter, there was negotiations, there was a commitment that within 10 years of the United Nations starting its work, there would be a review of all its provisions to see whether the negotiated provisions met the ground realities or not. So far, that review has not taken place.
Mhm. You know, it's interesting that you say that because one of the arguments seems to be the UN is using the very process by which reforms were supposed to be done to stop the reforms. Would that be a valid argument?
Yes, in fact, during the negotiations, it was Australia which came up with this very, very memorable statement that by giving the veto, you are making the entire United Nations hostage to one country. And I think on the ground, this is a statement that has proved itself to be true. And today, whichever war situation or conflict situation you look at, there is always the role of the veto, and that role has been dominated by the national interest of that big power, the permanent member of the Security Council. That veto has not been regulated or applied with a global perspective or the interests of the entire membership, etc. It is a very unilateral and national approach, which is using the veto as a lever in the hand of the major power. And as I said, it goes against the principle of great power responsibility.
I suppose that also applies to issues like terrorism, which the foreign minister raised. Where
Yes,
terrorists are
yes,
declared as terrorists by a certain group.
yes,
How?
yes. In fact,
But when you do
terrorism
that,
is, yeah, the
sorry, go ahead.
terrorist, the issue of terrorism, in fact, is a very interesting case study of what has happened and how the UN has gone wrong. Because terrorism is not there in the UN Charter. It was brought up for the first time in the UN General Assembly in 1972 after the Israeli Olympic athletes were massacred in Munich. And the United Nations wanted to take action to prevent the recurrence of terrorist acts like this massacre. And from 1972 to 1979, there was an ad hoc committee of the UN General Assembly, which was chaired by India, which proposed that we should adopt a legal approach in which we would prosecute the perpetrators of terrorism and bring them to justice. And that was the approach. And when this issue got raised in 1979, because of the politics of the Cold War and the confrontation between the permanent five members, the issue of terrorism was not pursued or not allowed to be pursued through the General Assembly, where the permanent members very often act through their proxies. So it was only in 1996, after the Cold War had ended, and 5 years after the Cold War had ended, that a draft of an international convention, legal convention to counter terrorism was tabled. And in fact, it was by India, the first draft. And that was discussed for a few years. Second draft was put in the year 2000. And then it was pushed to one side because by that time, there were two approaches that came into play. The first was in the General Assembly to adopt a sectoral approach, which meant that instead of a comprehensive legal convention to counter terrorism, there would be sectoral conventions to counter specific aspects of terrorism, like kidnapping for ransom, nuclear terrorism, financing of terrorism, and so on. So, legal conventions were adopted for these sectoral conventions. And for the common person, the most impact of these sectoral conventions has been the one on financing of terrorism, because out of that legal convention comes the whole concept of KYC and FATF and everything that affects the banking and financial sector today. So that was one approach, but it deflected the attention away from the comprehensive convention. The second was something that was assumed by the Security Council, uh, uh, because the permanent five members agreed to do so in the mid 1990s, and they started adopting resolutions to counter terrorism. Now, under Article 12 of the Charter, the moment an issue is with the Security Council, the General Assembly is not allowed to do anything on that issue. So, the entire focus on countering terrorism went into the Security Council and its creation of a very elaborate structure after the 9/11 bombings in America, which then got politicized because instead of countering terrorism in a neutral manner, the five major powers started to use different levers they created, especially the sanctions lists, the ban on financing, ban on movement, and so on, to create a kind of shadow world of terrorism in which they would dominate how it worked. And it came to a head in 2011 when they bifurcated the big list of terrorists, which was called the Al Qaeda sanctions list. They created a separate list for the Taliban, a separate list for Al Qaeda and its affiliates. And then the Taliban list became sort of whittled down until 2020. The Security Council adopted a resolution endorsing the mainstreaming of the Taliban as part of an
Mhm.
inclusive government in Afghanistan. Now, that was a decision taken in March 2020. And in August 2021, when the Security Council was confronted by the withdrawal of the armed International Security Assistance Force and NATO, they were not able to enforce this inclusive political government in Afghanistan, and therefore the Taliban de facto took power in Kabul. And I call that mainstreaming of terrorism. And that same pattern has been repeated in Syria in December 2024, when proscribed
Right.
terrorist groups from the Al Qaeda list, led by the Jabhat al Nusra, took power in Damascus. And today, the head of the Jabhat al Nusra at that time, known as Al Julani, is today known as President al Shara, and he's the de facto president of Syria. Again, mainstreaming of proscribed terrorist individual. So this is the Security Council's track record, and of course, we don't even need to talk about the way they've handled issues related to terrorism directed against India, especially most recently the Pahalgam attack, where they could not even name the country which committed this attack. So this is the reason why the terrorist focus has gone off the rails. And in the meantime, the General Assembly has been left with, an optic. And the optic is the global counterterrorism strategy adopted in 2006. The main point of that is how to develop capacities of member states to counter terrorism. But there's nothing to bring and prosecute the terrorists and bring them to justice, which was where we all started from. So this is a very good example of how the UN has made itself irrelevant.
Let's stay on that subject for another question in the sense that is it true that there is no clear definition of terrorism in the UN?
So if there is no definition of terrorism, then how are there 52 Security Council resolutions countering terrorism? A Security Council
Mhm.
resolution under Article 25 of the UN Charter is international law. So if there is no definition of the subject, then how are these resolutions international law? I always ask this question. I think
Mhm.
it's just an optic to deflect the attention of people away from the fact that international cooperation to counter terrorism has not been allowed to operate on the ground for political reasons. And these are driven by the major powers, the veto wielding permanent members of the Security Council.
Mhm. We also spoke about unilateral actions by the major powers. That includes things like, uh, financial sanctions and other things. How much of that has sort of diluted the UN's, place in the whole system?
Well, I think that that has also gone against the provisions of international cooperation in the UN Charter. The main sort of pillar on which international cooperation rests is the pillar that you will act according to multilaterally agreed rule of law, which is Article 25 of the UN Charter, which means Security Council decisions. Now, in the case of, say, measures like economic sanctions, unless the economic sanction is endorsed by the Security Council, it is not international law in that sense. It is a unilateral domestic law of one country or a group of countries of the United Nations. And therefore, it is not an obligation for the other countries of the United Nations to agree to abide by these unilateral measures which this country or group of countries have taken. And the best example are the unilateral sanctions on India, which have been imposed by the United States and by the European Union. These are absolutely illegal as far as India is concerned. Under Article 51 of India's constitution, it's the United Nations Charter which prevails in India, and we have a specific act of parliament which carries this into Indian law. But there is no Indian law that requires us to accept unilateral measures of countries against India. And in a sense, in a political sense, it is a kind of requirement that India go back to being a colonial country, that our system operates under the laws of some other country. And that, I think, for most Indians today is unacceptable.
Mhm. One of the other issues raised by our external affairs minister was that the global south, for want of a better word, is sort of being sidelined by the UN. Is that a valid argument to make?
Well, I think it depends on the issue. But if you take it on the issues raised by the global south, then if these issues are handled by the UN General Assembly, the global south numerically has a more than two-third majority in the UN General Assembly. So there are no issues that are on the agenda of the UN General Assembly on which the global south can be sidelined, because by sheer numbers of votes, the global south prevails on these issues. So, if the issue is on the agenda of the Security Council, then I think that is a very valid observation, because the global south is not represented as in the veto grouping of the Security Council. Uh, the veto powers are exercised by the three countries which are members of the NATO military alliance, which is the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. The veto power is exercised by Russia, which inherited continued this power from the Soviet Union, and the veto power is exercised by the People's Republic of China, which inherited this privilege from the Republic of China, because the People's Republic of China did not participate as a signatory to the UN Charter. It was only in October 1971 that the General Assembly replaced the Republic of China with what I call Communist China. So these five have their own sort of space and their own pedigree in terms of the power that they hold. And none of them, in that sense, have endorsed the global south. So issues of importance for the global south, which today mean development linked with peace and security, are not really treated in the perspective of the global south. And you just have to look at one of there are 52 or 54 conflicts on the agenda of the United Nations Security Council today. Many of them are in global south countries, but in none of them do global south countries participate with equal power, which means with veto rights. And I think the ones that are from the continent of Africa are the starkest illustration of where the global south has been completely ignored in the maintenance of peace and security, because there's not a single African country with the veto power in the UN Security Council. And that is why the demand for reforms has actually gathered momentum.
Mhm. In your opinion, I mean, since we're talking reforms, in your opinion, do you think the veto power itself is a problem, or do you think giving more power to representative countries would be a better option?
Well, I think again we go back to when the veto power was being discussed in 1945, because as far as India is concerned, and India's statements are very clear, they're recorded statements from 1945 onwards. We have seen the veto power as a safeguard mechanism. It was not supposed to be a mainstream instrument in the UN Charter. It was an instrument that would have been used in the rarest of the rare cases, and it was to be used on the principle of great power responsibility. Now, if we are to look at the way decisions are taken in the UN Security Council, then there's obviously a need to review this in today's ground realities. When there is no great power responsibility, and when the veto power is to be applied in the rarest of rare cases, but it's being applied more and more regularly by at least two out of the five permanent members. So there are two of the permanent members who, in fact, have not used the veto power since 1989, which is the United Kingdom and France. And so, therefore, even within the P5, there is a divergence on the need for the veto power. So, I think that this needs to actually be revisited and reviewed by the entire membership of the United Nations, which today is 193 compared to the 50 that took part in 1945. And that's a very important requirement. And for that, we need to have a review conference.
Hmm. We're almost running out of time. So let me ask you with another quick question, which is that, if you were to prioritize all the sort of reforms that are needed, do you think Security Council reforms is the main thing, or do you think there is something else which needs to be sort of handled before that? I mean, what would you prioritize the topmost
Well, I
thing that?
think yeah, I think in today's ground reality and today's world, Security Council reform is one component of reform of the entire UN system. The reform means reform of the charter. And not many people speak of it, but I do quite often. The charter itself contains a provision for reforming the charter, and that is Article 109. I think the time has come for Article 109, which is the review clause of the charter, to be implemented. At least the first step, which is to convene a general conference. That is the first step under Article 109. And to convene a general conference means to create a platform for dialogue of all the 193 countries to identify which are the issues which they would prioritize for reforming, reviewing, and reforming the UN Charter. To get the general conference to meet, the threshold is not difficult. It's 97 countries out of 193 in the General Assembly, and any 7 countries out of the 15 of the Security Council, and there's no veto involved. So you basically need a group of 97 in the General Assembly and a group of 7 in the Security Council to vote to convene a general conference. After that, what happens depends on the participating countries and their negotiators in the conference. But there is a whole menu which is already been drawn up of where the UN needs reform. Security Council, General Assembly needs reform to make it more powerful. The specialized agencies of the United Nations need reform. When we were in the COVID pandemic, we all remember the debates on the World Health Organization, for example. We need to bring in the digital domain, which is completely absent from the UN Charter. So we need to actually replace some provisions of the charter and bring in these new provisions. We need to take out an entire chapter called the Trusteeship Council, because there are no more countries who are operating under the trust of the major powers. In 1994, this last one became independent, which is Palau. So that whole chapter goes. And then, of course, very interestingly, there are some references in the charter which need to be also removed. For example, there's a reference to enemy state, and that members of the UN are not supposed to transact some business with the enemy state. Now the question was, in the year 2025, what is the enemy state? But when the charter was negotiated, the two enemy states were Japan and Germany. So it's in the interest of Japan and Germany actually to lead this review conference initiative, to have these references removed from the three articles where they occur in the UN Charter. But we cannot continue with business as usual and think that everything will carry on and nothing will happen on the ground, because the ineffectiveness of international cooperation is impacted on the ground, and is impacting in a very human centric manner, where people are losing their lives, they're losing their livelihoods, they're losing the places where they're living. And this is impacted on 2 billion out of 8 billion people in the world, according to the UN itself. So if 2 billion people are impacted by war and conflict, then surely it's time for us to have this review conference.
You mentioned that it's not all that difficult to get people together for this conference. Why has it not happened yet?
Well, it requires a country or a group of countries to take the lead. And I would assume that, having advocated reformed multilateralism, India should be leading that initiative, because it is, after all, a constituency which has been created by countries like India, the developing countries, the global south, call it what you will. But these countries were not there in 1945. They are very much there. They are in the majority today. So their voice has to be heard. And I think the three virtual conferences that India has hosted of the Global South provide the ideal platform for this initiative to be taken and implemented. So that by next year, for example, there will be a vote taken of to convene the general conference, with 97 out of 193 countries in the General Assembly and 7 out of 15 countries of the Security Council. So this is the first step. It's the easiest step to take. The difficult step is the second, where they have to agree on the agenda on what needs to be reviewed. And the most difficult challenge is to overcome the inbuilt veto of the 5 permanent members on whatever is agreed to in the review conference. But as I said, in diplomacy, once you enter the negotiation, anything is possible. It depends on the quality of the negotiator.
Hmm. I'm sure that, with people like you still working on that particular aspect, one can look forward to something good happening in that domain. But we have unfortunately run out of time. So, with that, we'll close this particular interview. Thank you so very much for putting this into perspective. And I look forward to having you with us again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raman.
That was Ambassador Ashok Mukerji, former permanent representative to the UN, talking to us about the UN at 80 and its relevance. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to seeing you again. Till then, this is Ramananda Sengupta.